Hi, I'm Michael.
And I'm Justin.
And this is our podcast where we discuss what we find interesting about the intersection of Web3 and digital security as we know it.
Between us, we have years of experience securing digital products and infrastructure, which has led us to be constantly curious about what's next.
Which is what this podcast is about, sharing our journey as we update our mental models for security in the next internet. All right. So, yeah, that was more energy than I expected to come into this. Welcome to part two of our discussion of, does this have a name? Mev Boost?
So it's the vulnerability was, Mev Boost exploitation. But our previous episode's name was 25 sitting on 25 mil. And I've realized I should have put part one. This will probably be 25 sitting on 25 mil. Part two, the observational analysis.
Yeah. So the idea is like in our last episode, we tried to cover it maybe from more like technical perspective, especially focusing on kind of how transactions get into the blockchain, what the space, both like technical, time, social kind of space that sits in front of the blockchain, because that's where this attack kind of sat. And then, you know, how the attack happened, what kind of that proceeding of events were. But I think we both, like when we first started talking about this event, we both had a lot of thoughts about it.
Yes, we did.
And I think that it is very like, it puts a lot of pretty like fine points on some things that both of us have been thinking about a lot with respect to crypto and blockchain and all that kind of stuff. And I think it really illustrates something that sits at the heart of this podcast and at the heart of our discussions about blockchain, which is in what sense, like kind of underneath the technical surfaces of it, and by going into the technical surfaces of it, how does the blockchain interact with us as people who live on the internet, as people who have like digital lives in a way? What are the social aspects of it? How do those combine with the technical aspects to make this kind of new horizons, these new vistas of the web, right? Which is the whole like Web3 thing, right?
Yep.
Okay. Does that make sense?
100%. I agree. And with those new vistas, what opportunities are there, good or bad? Because it's almost like, as I said, it's a brand new tech stack that enables brand new, not as I said, as we've previously discussed, it's a brand new tech stack that opens up the opportunity or the ideas for things to be done in a way that have never been done before digitally. But then that goes both ways. It's a tool at the end of the day, like all things, and they can be used to do harm or do good, dependent on the recipient. I guess we should do a quick recap,
sure.
Just in case you are joining this episode, if you've listening to this episode and not part one, I'd definitely recommend you go back to part one so you get some context. But long story short, this is about an exploit that took place, if I remember correctly, April 2023, I think.
We definitely do not have our notes up.
No, we do not. I think it's April 2023. And then basically in May 2024, the legal system caught up with the assailants. They tried to steal $25 million from a decentralized exchange in one execution/consensus cycle, as it's known. So basically within, I think it's one cycle. I think it's not an epoch. There's a collection of cycles making epoch. And that's 12 seconds on the Ethereum blockchain. And the reason they're able to do this is because there's this concept of maximum extractable value from blocks within blockchains. Long story short, they tried to front run transactions before they were written to the chain. And then basically what they did was they induced a trade to happen, in which case they stole a lot of the money that was being tied up as collateral for that trade to happen. But they stole it from a decentralized exchange. And a decentralized exchange, as opposed to a centralized exchange such as your Coinbase or your crypto.coms, is basically a co-op where people put their own assets in. So they tried to steal 25 million from people who have a lot of assets, but they were people at the end of the day, not faceless entities.
Okay. So the first thing is kind of putting this big like allegedly in front of things in this episode, because obviously the legal proceedings are their own kind of track of things going on. I don't know what the outcome of them will be. So that's fine. But then I think when like you started off with an interesting statement there, right? Because there's a few ways to look at this. One is there's a couple of questions that I think will like launch us into the interesting parts of this. One is like,
Cool.
who are the victims here? Because when you
Yep.
think about the kind of other crypto attacks that have gone on, like, exchanges getting hacked,
Mhm.
the degree to which that's a crypto hack is debatable. But even
Yeah.
other like, Web3 or blockchain native sort of attacks,
Mhm.
you do typically think of the victims as like, you know, end users in
Mhm.
Web2 speak, or like,
Yep.
regular citizen who's holding crypto in a wallet. Uh,
Agreed.
and that's not the case here so much,
Mhm.
right? Here, the
Yeah.
primary victims, or the people who had an adverse effect from this thing going on, were not regular crypto users, to my understanding.
And I mean,
Well, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I'll let you talk.
Okay,
Yeah, go
okay.
on.
Rein me in. Uh,
I mean, I mean, the only thing I'll jump in there is I mean, they're financial traders of crypto, so they are regular crypto users, but they obviously, sorry to get into the details, but the bots that they use, that is the bots that were exploited, and these bots were basically front running trades. So yes, they are very sophisticated parties who are basically unscrupulously, for want of a better phrase, ripping off your average trader.
yeah. So the idea is like in this space in front of the blockchain where you
Hmm.
have these transactions getting reordered,
Hmm.
uh, there's a set of users who
Hmm.
are engaged in that activity, or a set of participants in the crypto ecosystem who
Hmm.
are using this, this MEV market and this MEV like economy
Hmm.
to extract value, right? That's literally what it is.
Yep.
It's like
Yeah,
extractable
literally.
value, right?
Because they have access to information before the rest of the participants of the market
Yes,
do.
that value, like the core of that value, if you're looking at it from like an economic lens, the core of that value is
Hmm.
basically information asymmetry, or like
Hmm.
information in time asymmetry.
Yep.
Um, and so they're extracting value out of the transactions that are happening. So
Hmm.
the people, like the players in the ecosystem who lost value as a result of
Hmm.
this going on, were um, bots, like basically
Hmm.
flash bots
Yep.
participating in this ecosystem, right?
Yep. 100%.
Uh, and so that's interesting, right? And I think when we both heard about, like when we both first started researching this event,
Hmm.
um, I think we both had a bit of a question around it, which, to like
Hmm.
uh, put it in like kind of stark terms, is like, is what this threat is doing different from what the regular participants in this ecosystem are doing?
Right. Because to my mind, when I first came across this and going into details, I was like, well, they just exploited people who were exploiting something else. However, the other people exploited their position in the market, which is technically unfair, I guess, in some ways. Whereas they just exploited a technical implementation in what was supposed to be a leveler, for people being able to get access to the information about the transactions coming up. So they kind of outsmarted the people who were trying to outsmart the average crypto. It's like kind of a Russian doll effect almost. There's exploiters all the way
Yeah,
down.
well, I
But
think
long story short, yeah, go on.
like I think that's a good point. There's multiple layers to this,
Hmm.
because like, and this goes back a little bit to that discussion around how this market around MEV in the mempool
Hmm.
established itself, right? Because like
Yep.
the first thing that happened was that there was like the kind of initial state of this was that like larger players were more able to effectively extract value
Hmm.
from the mempool space, and
Yep.
from the reordering of transactions,
Yep.
um, than smaller players.
Yep.
And that felt unfair, I guess,
Yes.
right?
That goes against the egalitarianism that is supposed to be delegated proof of stake. As long as you have the right you cross the threshold for the amount of assets you hold, every validator or every player is supposed to have an equal an equal input or an equal effect, I guess, or an equal opportunity to support the network, basically, and propose transaction blocks. Everyone, no matter how big you are, no matter how much more above that threshold, everyone is supposed to have the same one person, one vote kind of thing, or one entity, one vote type thing.
So so then like in response to that, there's different approaches a community could take, or there's different approaches like an ecosystem could take to try
Mm-hmm.
to rectify that initial
Mm-hmm.
state.
Yep.
The approach that was taken here was to try to accept that there is this ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
and to attempt and to make it a market,
Yeah.
and to have fairness be determined by like market participation,
Mm-hmm.
instead of by trying to say like by fiat to, is that a pun? I don't know if that counts as a pun. but
That does.
but to
That's good.
say
That's a
to
good
say
one.
like
That's a meta
transactions
one.
must be ordered according to some
Mm-hmm.
algorithm, and all participants need to use that algorithm to
Mm-hmm.
whatever, like trying to enforce it that way, right?
Yeah.
And then that was kind of a a stable-ish state to things.
Mm-hmm.
And then this player introduced themselves into the ecosystem
Mm-hmm.
and took advantage of some technical I don't know what you would call them, like vulnerabilities, I guess would be the classical term,
Yeah.
but let's say some technical vulnerabilities in the software
Mm-hmm.
involved here
Yeah.
to further extract value.
Yeah.
um and that value wasn't being extracted from directly from the transactions going through. That value
Mm-hmm.
is being extracted from the market participants in this ecosystem.
And I think that's why the short answer to it is yes, there is a crime committed there, because you weren't outsmarting the system. You were just taking advantage of of a hole in the system that allowed you to rob Peter effectively. And so that's why in short, there is a crime. That's why the DOJ is involved. That's why there are 3 charges laid out against these 2 individuals. But again, circling back to the original question is, okay, but now you've got unscrupulous individuals who are setting up decentralized exchanges. Well, maybe they're not setting them up, but they're participating in decentralized exchanges, allowing these bots to front run trades when people are just innocently trying to interact with the blockchain. And by the way, if you don't know, in order to interact with the blockchain, everything is a transaction. So when you write back to the blockchain, you create a transaction. If people are therefore taking advantage of the fact that you're in the mempool, but you're not on chain, your transaction hasn't been written to the chain due to consensus yet, you can be disadvantaged. And all you're trying to do is just interact with this technology for whatever reason. So that's why it's like, okay, so I get that there was a crime. Am I going to shed tears over the victims? Not necessarily. I'm happy to be corrected on that. Obviously, we both are. This is our learning journey. But at this moment in time, I'm not. My heart doesn't bleed for it. And so this also kind of kicks off, why did we care about this? Because this kind of hit quite a few, like you said, for me, it hit another couple of points. The financialization of blockchain, which is what became crypto and why blockchain lent itself to crypto, the financialization of the solution and the marketplace solution, as 2 security professionals, boring old so-called graybeards, that was an approach that I would just never would have crossed my mind. Because at the end of the day, if we have this thing, if someone had presented this tech stack to me and said, oh, so we have this mempool thing, but not all transactions are going to be created equal because there's a financialization aspect to this. There are assets in this, and therefore transactions in the mempool waiting to be written to the blockchain can be taken advantage of. I would have said, obfuscate that, obfuscate them all, or stop, or basically put in some technical control that makes sure that information, access to that information is gated to everybody equally. Now, just as an asterisk, you do not, as a validator or a player in the blockchain market of MEV Boost or MEV, you do not have to participate. You don't have to do MEV Boost. You can still be a validator with your mempool and have your transactions come in and seek consensus the good old fashioned way. But as a validator, the whole point you're a validator is to make money of participating in this network, and Mev Boost or Mev, sorry, gives you extra money. Like it's another revenue stream. So yeah, but I find that fascinating because it was almost a learning point for me in terms of, and I don't know if that it made you reflect, Michael, but in terms of, I've one of the great things I love about doing product security is basically the problem is as interesting as the product. So when you start doing really, and everyone comes up with crazy, wacky ideas of products, digital products, and sometimes they are so left of field that as a security professional, you have no pattern
Mm.
for them, and so you have to do original thinking, and that's where I really get into my bag personally, and I think you're pretty similar as well. And so had I ever thought about financializing or basically gamifying or creating a market-based solution, so to speak, for what is technically a security, is it security, it's not a vulnerability, but there's definitely an asymmetry, or there are definitely exploit opportunities from this information access asymmetry. That's a lot of words,
Yeah.
but basically there are opportunities for exploit. What do you think? I think the solution was kind of ingenious, but also lent itself to this kind of problem as well, because money.
Yeah. So I think like there's a probably a philosophical dividing line between people on whether you think this information asymmetry should exist or not. I think
Mm,
probably some people think like this should not exist, and
yeah.
so you have a kind of design constraint that you should
Hmm.
design for this to not exist.
Hmm.
Um, that's probably a difficult design constraint to meet.
It's very difficult. I think it would kick off an arms race, quite
Yeah, exactly,
frankly.
right? To what extent can you actually make it not exist?
Hmm.
You know, like I don't like to always kind of draw those direct lines from like traditional finance into crypto,
Mm,
but like
yeah.
a lot of these things you can draw those lines directly, right? Like this is basically
Yeah.
like, the kind of I don't know the right terms, I'm going to use the wrong finance terms,
No,
but
it's
like the
fine. Same.
market making like
Hmm.
high frequency trading, liquidity providing, all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
in a sense is what this is, but in Web3. And so there
Yeah.
are definitely people in traditional finance who have this same philosophical question, like should that exist or not, and take
Hmm.
different like approaches to that. So I think that's one dividing line. If you think it shouldn't exist, then you have a design constraint.
Hmm.
I need to design so that this doesn't exist. If you're
Agreed.
okay with it existing, um, then you have another kind of philosophical question, I think, which is like basically like should this feel fair, or should this
Mm.
be like a fundamentally anarchic sort of
Hmm.
ecosystem?
Agreed.
Um, so if you trace the path to answering those questions, like the current state of it is, should this exist or not? It seems like
Hmm.
broadly the community has answered yes.
Yeah.
This should exist, or at least it's neutral that
Hmm.
this exists.
Yeah.
Um, but then they take the other fork that it can exist, but it should feel fair that it exists.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like anyway, I don't know if we're getting too philosophical. I think there's a way in which like it is in a sense more consistent philosophically to say
Hmm.
that it can exist and it should have no rules around it.
Hmm.
Like that is a
Yeah.
consistent philosophical stance to take. Um,
Agreed.
if you don't take that stance and you say it should exist and it can exist, but it should feel fair, um, you get into a lot of like ambiguous sort of questions around,
Yeah.
well, then how should it be set up? Like, how exactly should it be
100%.
fair? Should it be fair to whom? Like, who should it be fair to? And who is it okay to not be
What's
fair
that
to?
classic term you and I both used to
Oh,
whenever we go into conversations with engineers? Opinionated.
opinionate. Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
So basically, it's if this thing should exist, are we going to be opinionated about how it should exist? Well, if it's going to exist, I think by nature we shouldn't be opinionated because we're basically saying let the market decide. So truly let the market
yeah,
decide. Instead, we decided to be opinionated about how the market should work. And then when you start to do that and you start to build technical controls, well, that's where things get sticky, so to speak, because humans make mistakes, but you've decided to control a market. there are going to be loopholes, and this loophole was a technical vulnerability that allowed these two assailants to try and drain $25 million worth of assets from a decentralized exchange in 12 seconds. I agree with you 100%. Another point of why we cared about this is really and truly around the idea of security boundaries as well. Like this one kind of, it was, you and I both have worked on financial products throughout our career, and some of the statistics around like traditional credit card finance fraud and traditional finance, consumer facing finance fraud, the numbers are eye watering. And one of the constant attacks against crypto, and there are many things bad about crypto, but one thing's constant is that it gets hacked all the time, which actually isn't true. Even though if you listen to this podcast, you're going to think it does, but it actually isn't true. And also, it's never actually the underlying. Very rarely is it the underlying blockchains. It's normally features of a blockchain, so to speak, that gets compromised, like bridges and things like that. What was impressive about this one was how quickly they were able to identify the assailants and basically ask for the money back, which is unheard of. And they would, I'm assuming they would have been, the deal would have been, give us the money back and you go home, no muss, no fuss. But they said no, because they genuinely didn't think they were doing anything wrong, even though they did look up statute of limitations on some crimes. But yeah, so like the numbers here, I casually looked up. Now, to be fair, obviously, crypto finance is actually much smaller as a percentage of overall world global markets. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. But I mean, in 2022, almost just under $30 billion alone worldwide was attributed to credit card fraud and debit card fraud. And in a lot of instances, as anyone who's been a victim of credit card fraud will know, I have. I don't know if you have, but I do, especially in the UK, doing a lot of online shopping, etc. Or when I lived in the UK, they just basically reimburse the victim and move on. It's just the cost of doing business. I've even spoken with senior security leaders who have said, I think I remember correctly, don't quote on this, like they worked for one payment card network and it was like $20 million a month was nothing. Like, because in terms of credit card, there's just literally a line item. Here we had 25 million stolen, but they tracked it down within 6 hours to the assailants, and within a year they got arrested. I don't know. Maybe it does happen for major credit card fraudsters, but even then, you hear of cases taking years and years to be identified, people to be identified and taken to court, and even tracking that. I find the transparency of the blockchain, I think, in my opinion, my humble opinion, the transparency of the blockchain, the fact that everything's open and everything can be tracked, 100% played into them being able to move as quickly on this. And in some ways, that gives me more confidence in. I'm not a big crypto head, as you know. It's called Not Your Crypto Podcast. That's the whole point. We care about the tech. That gives me more confidence in the underlying tech stack, because the fact that it is so transparent, and therefore people are able to actually say, hey, something's going on here, within hours of it happening. Anyone who's done any security incident response will know that you'll know something's going on here, and then attributing it to who are two very different exercises. Like, to this day, even if it's an APT, so it's advanced persistent threat, i.e. nation state actor, trying to attribute that is like a game of whack-a-mole. It's just like, at the point, you just say who you think it is and go from there, unless you've got an inside person or who actually knows and is willing to talk. So I found that quite fascinating as well. I don't know about you, Michael. What did you think of, well, the security boundary type thing, and also in comparing it to traditional finance, consumer-facing finance fraud and crimes that ilk?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Like, there's two aspects to that to me. One is that, yeah, you're right. Like in the traditional world, traditional like commercial world, you wouldn't notice this for a long time, probably. And then once you do notice it, you wouldn't know what happened for an even longer amount of time. So yeah, I think there's a way in which the built-in transparency of the blockchain enables kind of like, I don't know if I want to say the word like fast failure, but you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
quick failure and recovery in a way.
Yeah.
Though, like, I guess the recovery aspect, not so much. but at least
Yeah.
never mind.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
But no, you're right. Like there is a speed difference of that because it's transparent, and I think like
Hmm.
you can trace that discussion back to the um like you can trace that discussion back to like open source security kind of
Hmm.
discourse, right? Like in the
Hmm.
older days, like I feel like this isn't as much of a discussion anymore. There was some of the supply chain stuff going on. I don't know, people kick it up
Yeah.
again. But like, back in the like 2000s and whatever, it
Hmm.
was like, well, is open source secure? That was like a big question people would talk about, right?
Yeah.
Well, everybody knows the source code, so everybody can find.
Yeah. Everybody looks at the
Yeah.
source code.
And so,
Turned
it
out
was like, well,
nobody.
is more eyes better or is less eyes better? And
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
not as much a material like part of the discourse at the any as much anymore, but I think you can trace that through to here and say
Hmm.
like, yeah, blockchain having all the transactions be in a public immutable ledger
Hmm.
means that anything that happens can within short order have a large number of eyes
Hmm.
on it.
Yeah.
And that does help for quick attribution and quick kind of discovery and research about what happened. Like the entire state of
Hmm.
what happened is is known, right?
Is known to everybody. Yeah.
Um, so, but what was the other part of that? Well, then the other part of that is like anonymization, I guess, right?
Hmm.
Because yeah, I think there's definitely a large sense in which it is like I don't know. I guess I haven't actually done like tried anything or whatever, but I think seeing more of these things happen, I think there's a large sense in which like in a way it's actually easier to be anonymous in Web 2 world than in Web 3 world.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, like making a you could think of it as like making an OPSEC mistake in Web
Hmm.
3 um, is is catastrophic to an attacker,
It's
right?
catastrophic.
Like if I'm a threat
100%.
and I make an OPSEC mistake and two identities get linked,
Hmm.
that can be an immediate, complete game over for
Yeah.
the threat, right?
It's game over.
And that is generally
100%.
not the case in Web two. Like in
Yeah.
more traditional attacks, more traditional threats, the way they operate.
Hmm.
Um, I yeah, there's a sense in which it is much easier
Hmm.
to be anonymous. I think I don't know. I haven't thought that point
Yeah.
out super well. Um, which like that's interesting, isn't it? In terms
Yeah.
of
I
what we've
think
been
it
told
is.
about crypto.
Well, this is the thing because we then get back to privacy, right? And it's almost by design, blockchain makes the assumption that privacy isn't necessary. Yes, you can be pseudonymous, but at the same time, once you're able to tie data points together, we've got an identification. We've identified an end user. We've identified a third party. We've identified a party. So the question now comes to my mind is, okay, so this lack of privacy was very positive in this instance, but what opportunities does it exclude? What opportunities does it exclude itself from supporting as a result of this assumption? And again, just to double back to our very first episode, none of us believe here that Web3 is to replace Web2, even though it's called Web3, it gives you that impression. They are running side by side. That's just kind of the way it is. One's for one use case, the other's for the other. But then I'm like, are there consumer facing use cases that Web3 is now no longer designed, or when you think about it, is designed explicitly to not be used for whatever reason? It's opinionated about not being used but for whatever reason, and is that to its own detriment? Is that what could be hindering its what's the word, its adoption by the masses in certain instances? Because now we have to, again, as we said in our first episode, you now have to think of problems completely differently, and data is data is a first class citizen in the internet. If data needs privacy, or if you have a set of data and privacy is a requirement, blockchain is going to be very difficult argument for you to make as an enterprise or as a single person startup to use. And therefore, is it shutting itself out of? Is that the whole point? Was it just never a concern when it was first um, what's the word, when it was first imagined, for example, especially Ethereum as well, because obviously that's a distributed computing, whereas Bitcoin, when it first came out, was just literally a digital currency, and so privacy and data were never really considered. But when you have distributed computing now, decentralized computing, the question becomes, well, you're going to be computing on data, and therefore, how are you going to enforce privacy where necessary? What does privacy look like? What does data ownership look like? So again, it starts me down that path again, and that's a question I've always had since I've come across this tech stack. And brains bigger than mine have written theses on it. I think even the EU published a white paper on it a few years ago, and it's like 90 pages long and makes for some interesting reading if you can stay awake long enough. And so again, it just makes this question come back up again. But then also on the flip side of that is, what is it excluding from? What new concepts or use cases have I not thought of, or have we not been thought of, because we're so used to this concept of client server data aggregation, power aggregation, so to speak, in centralized entities. Do I now need to go and meditate somewhere and break out of that mold of thinking? Do I need, like, and if so, therefore, will blockchain step into that breach? Yeah, so that's one of the things that's definitely come back to me is, how am I thinking about this technology wrong? Or maybe it's just in its use case and that's all it's going to ever be, is a really good crypto and then some decentralized computing with the dApps. But again, you're trying very hard to avoid the centralization of data. I don't know. That one's still mulling around in my brain as well. Any opinions or thoughts there for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the way you're thinking about it is similar.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like I'm taking way too long to speak, aren't I? I don't know. I think
Privacy,
yeah,
blockchain,
thanks. Yeah, just
use
keep throwing the words. Something
cases.
we'll take eventually.
Yeah.
I think yeah, I mean the privacy aspect of it is huge, obviously. I think in a way, like in a core technical way, the systems themselves are just about neutral to those concepts. Like the concept
Mm-hmm.
of privacy, of personal information, of whatever, is like a
Mm.
social concept that we want to bring to the technical system. The
Mm.
technical system itself doesn't have a native concept of it. It's like entirely neutral to that being something we want to bring to it.
Yeah. True.
Um,
True.
and so that makes a huge amount of friction. I
Mm-hmm.
think there is something to the do we have the wrong paradigm? Like, are we just hardwired into the wrong paradigm for thinking about
Mm.
how these systems can be used? Especially if we
Yeah.
think about them as like hybrid systems where, one
Mm.
piece is doing its job and another piece is doing its job.
Yeah.
I think so. And, like you said, like, yeah, if you went away and, like transcended your own limitations, like as a child of Web 2, maybe you
Yeah.
could come to something interesting.
Come back. Yeah.
I think we probably have room for some more philosophical episodes again, but I think in terms of like
Mm-hmm.
what that makes me think of is some of our earlier discussions about, like, to me, one of the keys to understanding Web3 is inverting ownership of things on the internet.
Yeah.
Because in a Web 2 world, we talked about how um, the place where code runs is the place that like
Mm-hmm.
ownership is exercised over something, right? And so in
Yeah.
a way, you don't really own anything on the internet
Yeah.
in our Web 2 world.
No.
There's like a spark of possibility that is different in Web 3. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the thread that I would follow to like try to break out of that. But
Yeah. One
I don't
hundred
know.
percent.
I'm definitely still noob at this stuff.
Yeah, still noob, and we're still busy people who have other commitments, and so haven't got the actual mind space. But I definitely do want to pull on that thread more, because I do, again, heart on sleeve, I do find this space incredibly interesting. I think some incredibly clever people are building some incredibly interesting things, and I do think it's going to play an even bigger role than it already stealthily does going forward. I think they've, I mean, enterprises are now definitely starting to take notice in terms of they've got some use cases for it, and I think we're going to see that happen in the near future, next few years at the very least. We're going to see some things that you're not even going to know are running on blockchain are running on blockchain because it solves their problem. Oh, how long is that now? I think we've done it quite a bit of time. How do you want to wrap this up then? So philosophically, I guess from my perspective, I think the takeaways from this was basically the top three I can go through are the concept of using a market solution to what is technically what could be argued is a security issue or an implementation issue, definitely an engineering issue. So basically, market-based solution to an engineering problem is definitely the top one. I will definitely add that into my backpack, so to speak, in terms of how I like to approach problems in the future, technical problems, technical security problems in the future. The next one was community, really and truly. Like the attack, they use this word a lot whenever you go to a blockchain conference or hang around blockchain people. They always talk about community, and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. You have, like, what? There's no such thing as community. Like, but there actually is. There is this concept of community. They do, a lot of them do reside on Twitter, for better or for worse, and they literally tweeted out, the attack is happening, this is happening, XYZ. They all spoke and they all kicked into gear. Next thing you know, the DOJ was able to rock up these guys' doors a year later. So there is actually a Web3 community, and they actually do talk to each other, and that is nice. That is nice to see that there are dedicated people who have the passion, and that's why I'm a bullish. I'm a bull. I believe in tech because it's got real people at the end pushing it, as opposed to certain other hype cycles where it's only coming from one specific community or one specific group of people with a very, very obvious what's the word, motivated interest, so to speak, or something like that. And then the final thing is, again, how do I, not just privacy but bigger than privacy, but privacy brought me here, is how do I think about the use cases and how this thing,
for sure,
this tech stack should be used and can be used. Those are my top three. What about you, Michael?
Okay. I think like
you don't have to do three, by the way.
No,
sorry, I just
good. That's good. I think if I were, like let's say I was myself. That's a weird thing to say.
Okay, as opposed to someone else. Yeah,
and I was like trying to learn about this. I was trying to learn about crypto. I was trying to kind of figure things out and get started in understanding these things, right? The thing about this that it is interesting is, like, I would look at this and say, okay, what happened? And why, what happened, and do I think what happened was wrong? And why do I think that? And then pay attention to where and when am I trying to answer a technical question about that, and where and when am I trying to answer a social question about that? Because I think that's kind of the instructive part of it to me, right? Like those two things are very easy to get linked in your mind and think you're doing one when you're doing the other. And then the next thing that really sticks out to me about it is where am I talking about the blockchain, and where am I talking about an ecosystem built around or beside or before the blockchain? Because I think when we talk about things from a technical perspective, a security perspective, and a social perspective, it's like a lot of things happen in the kind of liminal spaces around the blockchain. And it's good to kind of be able to situate yourself like mentally when you're talking about these things.